Pike position, lower abdominals, level 1. In the pike position, lower abdominals, level 1 exercise, you're not going to have a lot of movement. It's going to be really limited movement. And what you're doing, you can rest. And then what you're doing is you're going to have the hips at about 70 to 90 degrees of flexion, anywhere in here. Then you're going to let your pelvis go into an anterior pelvic tilt position. Rest for a second. So the anterior pelvic tilt position is this. So while you're laying on your back, you'll let your back actually round like this. You do need to be careful. You do need to be careful to not do this position excessively. So go ahead and bring those legs up. So Dr. Gabby is going to roll her pelvis this way, but she's not going to go to the end where it's kind of really straining the spine. You do need to use a lot of caution with that. Once you get into that position, then you're going to roll the pelvis towards a posterior position, smash the lower back down against the mat, and try to get a little bit of a lift. The goal is you're not necessarily going to get a big lift here. Maybe you might get 1 or 2 inches maximally. Really the goal here is for you to begin to learn to contract and recruit, have neurological connection with your lower abdominals. So roll into that anterior pelvic tilt position, keeping the same degree of hip flexion, then roll back to a posterior pelvic tilt and try to lift those legs up a little bit by squeezing big time with the lower abdominals. And again, hip flexion degrees stays the same. So this joint stays the same. What changes is the pelvic position going into anterior pelvic tilt, squeezing back towards posterior, recruiting the lower abdominals. Now, it's very possible that your lower back might have some pain in this exercise, and that's not good. You don't want to have lower back pain. The reason for that lower back pain is you're letting yourself go into what's called hyperlordosis. So you're letting this pelvis roll too far into this hyperlordotic position. You can see I'm supporting Dr. Gabby's legs here because as I bring her pelvis into excessive anterior pelvic tilt position, is really not healthy for the lumbar spine to be in this position and then go into that excessive anterior pelvic tilt. So you want to control that, right? You want to kind of limit how far you're letting your back arch. So if you start to limit how far you're letting your lower back arch, that lower back pain very likely will begin to go away. The way to regress this exercise a step further, if you're still having some issues, it's very hard for you, potentially you have lower back pain, is go ahead and just bend the knees. There's going to be less leverage placed onto the lower abdominals when the knees are bent. So we're going to do the same exercise, hip flexion degrees here stays the same, roll into anterior pelvic tilt, squeeze back towards posterior pelvic tilt there, and then let's go back into another rep. Going anterior pelvic and then back to posterior. Going anterior pelvic tilt with the knees bent and back to posterior. So what you're seeing here is hip flexion degrees stays the same. This motion of this is really fixed. The ankles, knees, hips is in a fixed position, and the only thing that moves is the whole pelvis is rotating anterior, posterior, anterior, posterior. The key element, that's all driven right here from the lower abdominals. So she's recruiting from those lower abdominals, squeezing here and pulling towards posterior pelvic tilt.